Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webcast Respect, Delivering Results by Giving Employees What They Really Want, sponsored by Engage2Excel. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that this webcast has been pre-approved for HR certification credits, HRCI and SHRM credits. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast to receive your credits. You will receive an email from HR.com within 1 to 2 business days, which will include the certification credit information. Questions may be submitted anytime during the webcast by typing the question in the Ask a Question text field and clicking Submit, the orange button located on your screen. And I will now turn it over to Jeff Jelinas.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff Jelinas. I'm from Engage2Excel. Very excited to be with you today. Just a little bit about myself. I've spent the last several years in product management, but my prior life resides in human resources management. And I think we have a really interesting topic to go through with you today, especially considering that engagement is so top of mind for our most senior leaders today. I think it's going to be a great session. I have the pleasure of working closely with Dr. Jack Wiley, who is our main speaker today. Jack is an author, consultant, researcher, instructor. He has many hats, but we've been working closely with him at Engage2Excel. He has almost 3 decades worth of research that has focused on 2 main questions. One is what employees most want, and the second is organizational factors that best promote employee engagement, performance confidence, and business success. So Jack, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Jeff.
We also have on the line Tyler Morrison and Melissa Meunier from Engage2Excel. They're going to be helping us with the questions that come in. And as we go throughout the presentation, please feel free to ask a question. We'd love to keep it as engaging as we can. Jack, if you could go to the next slide. I'm going to kick things off by talking a little bit about business problems that are related to employee engagement. And Jack, you can move right into the next slide. But before we do that, let's talk about defining employee engagement. I know that there are a lot of definitions out there of engagement. In this definition, and I'll just read this for you aloud, the extent to which employees are motivated to contribute to organizational success and are willing to apply discretionary effort to accomplishing tasks important to the achievement of organizational goals. I think the key language in this definition, and Jack, I think you'll agree, is really around willingness to apply discretionary effort. I think a lot of us are here to understand what that secret sauce is to create an environment where employees are inclined to apply discretionary effort. And I won't steal Jack's thunder, but he's going to take you through what employees actually want based on 30 years of research, which will lead us down the path of higher employee engagement. Next slide, please, Jack. We know that employee engagement has a direct impact on business metrics, and that's been proven over and over. Jack's going to give you more evidence of that fact in his presentation today. Whether it's turnover, customer service, quality, safety, there's a direct impact. And to go a step further, positive or negative impact on all of these metrics in turn affects the business's bottom line. If you think about customer service, for instance, and I call out this specific one because I think that we can all recall either a positive or negative experience as a customer in our personal lives, a disengaged employee today can be incredibly harmful to business, especially as you think about the world that we live in where it's so easy for customers to socialize their experience on social media. So in summary, employee engagement impacts all aspects of your organization's performance, and these are just a couple of examples. Next slide, please, Jack. Here are a few facts about engagement today from a recent PwC study. The first is that companies with highly engaged employees enjoy 33% higher profits, 51% lower turnover, with satisfied employees, which is, lowers your regrettable turnover, and an increase in performance-related business outcomes by 2.5 times. So if you're looking at these numbers and you're thinking, how can I make a difference? It really starts with one important question. And with Jack, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone this morning and to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that is, what is the most important thing employees want from the organizations for which they work? A little bit of background as to where this question came from. As Jeff indicated, I've been involved in this kind of activity for a number of years, and some of us on the webcast today may remember back, let's say back to the mid-1980s. Some of you may not have been around at that point in time, but back in the mid-1980s, we were regularly conducting employee satisfaction surveys. Engagement hadn't emerged on the landscape yet. We would call them employee satisfaction surveys, and it was not uncommon, believe it or not, for employee satisfaction surveys to be primarily 150 to 200 items in length. They focused on a couple of major topics, that is, what caused employees to be satisfied, but in a lot of employee relations scenarios, it was also a concern about what might cause employees to want to be represented by a third party, to be represented from a labor relations point of view by a union. And so large organizations regularly conducted employee satisfaction surveys, but they were humongous in length. And it took a lot of time for organizations actually to compile the data and to use the data. And it occurred to me that it was really unnecessary to ask that many questions in an employee survey. Why don't we focus on the kind of information we can derive from employees that would be most impactful to them in terms of their working relationship with that organization? And so hence, I came up with the question, what is the most important thing employees want from the organizations for which they work? Now, I actually was in a position where I was able to conduct a series of studies with a representative sample of employees, first in the United States, but then expanded. And actually, over the course of 25 years, we began collecting data from the 12 largest economies in the world, representing about 70% of the world's gross domestic product, capturing all generational groups, all job types, all major industries, and done in a way that was truly representative of the workers in those different countries. As you can see, we're looking at not only the United States, but the big five, if you will, sectors in Europe in terms of countries that produce the most domestic product. We're also looking in Asia at countries such as Japan, China. We're looking in Latin America, countries like Canada, like Brazil, also Canada represented from the Americas in this. So it was truly a broad spectrum, not only of historically large economies, but also emerging economies as well. And the question posed was simply, what is the most important thing you want from the company for which you work? Employees answered those questions, or that question, in their own words. And as we think about this, I actually want you to be thinking too, how would you answer the question, what is the most important thing you want? My rationale was, if we knew the most important thing that employees wanted, we could go to work on assessing that, taking necessary action from an organizational development point of view, and build the kinds of organizations that people would be excited about coming to work at and excited about staying. Well, here are the results of this research that was condensed beginning in 1988 through 2012. We took a look at what employees most wanted, and what we found was that it represented 7 major factors. 20%, 1 out of every 5 employees, said the most important thing they wanted was to be recognized for the contribution they're making to the organization, for their commitment to the organization, for the work they do. They wanted to be recognized from that organization for their contributions. Another 6% of employees said that they most wanted to be involved in work that they would find exciting, meaningfully challenging work. Almost 1 out of 5 indicated that the most important thing they wanted, frankly, was to have a secure job, to work in an organizational setting in which they had confidence, and that would provide a sense of stability for them in their employment. Not surprisingly, 1 out of every 4, the largest slice of the pie, if you will, indicated that the most important thing they wanted was to be paid fairly. So it wasn't actually about more pay, but it was about being paid fairly for the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they brought into the work environment and the actual effort that they extended. 8%, slightly less than 1 out of every 10, said that what they wanted was to further their education and career growth. Normally we might call this simply career development, but to let you in on a little issue that I had to deal with, I actually needed a second E to form the acronym RESPECT, so I front-ended this by calling it education and career growth. 15% of people said that the most important thing they wanted was positive working conditions. And again, I shortened this to conditions to get me down the path toward naming this RESPECT. But when we talk about positive working conditions, interestingly enough, it wasn't just safety and security, although that's important, but it was more about the interpersonal work environment. The notion of liking the kind of people that they worked with, finding them to be supportive of them, and operating in a spirit of cooperation. And then finally, about 1 out of every 10, 8% to be precise, said the most important thing they wanted was to be told the truth. This was primarily the truth from senior leadership about the direction the organization was headed and how well it was performing, but also it was from their direct line managers in terms of how they perceived the performance of those subordinate employees. So people wanted knowledge of results, if you will, about how well they were doing, and they wanted to be told honestly from their direct line managers about how their performance was perceived. And so, interestingly enough, when we boil all of this down, all but 2% of all of the written comments that we received about what employees most wanted, not just from the United States, but fundamentally representing the world's workforce, or at least from the largest economies around the world, it boiled down to these 7 things that form the acronym of RESPECT, respect. What employees most want is to be respected. I want to advance our understanding a little bit about what each of these values, if you will, that employees are seeking from their employer mean. And I'll do that by sharing some things that pertain to how employees describe these values in their own words. So, for example, a recognition, as I've already alluded to, means a pat on the back, acknowledgement for a job well done from both their immediate manager but the organization at large. Remember, 20% of the employees said that this was their most important want. This is how they expressed it in their own terms. Recognition when we do a good job, respected and recognized as a valuable team member, more respect from senior management. So I want you to think about something. What is the impact on perceptions of immediate managers who do a particularly good job of recognizing their employees? So, for example, in our database, which includes not only this qualitative data, but also we have answers to a number of rating scale questions. Let's think about what the impact is on how a manager is perceived as carrying out their responsibilities if, in fact, the people reporting to them see them doing a good job in recognizing employees. And here we go. We are comparing and contrasting here along the horizontal graph, if you will, different things that managers are responsible for: managing the tasks, managing people, keeping commitments, building confidence, and actually being seen as an outstanding leader. What we're separating out and comparing is what happens when employees feel that their contributions are valued. How does that contrast against the condition where they do not believe their contribution is valued? And what you can see very dramatically is that leaders who do a good job of recognizing their employees are also seen, quite frankly, as being superior leaders across a wide variety of managerial responsibilities. And so this actually leads, I think, to an interesting poll question that we're going to pull up now, and that Jeff is going to talk about as we introduce.
Great, thank you, Jack. So, one of the things that we wanted to call out is that recognition, to your point, Jack, can take on many forms, from performance-based recognition to social recognition to recognition for length of service at an organization. Let's look at a polling question around the latter, service-based recognition. And we're going to give about a minute for folks to vote. What percent of 25 to 34-year-olds believe service awards are effective and make people feel valued? Select one, 0 to 24%, 25 to 49, 50 to 79, or 80 to 100%. And we'll pause to see the results in just a moment. So far, we've got about 61% of the people that have voted. That's a great response rate early on. That means you guys are all awake. And we're just at about 70%. We'll give it another 15 seconds or so. All right, we are at about 76% who have voted. Kathy from HR.com, could you help revealing the results?
There should be up on the screen now for you.
Perfect. So this is interesting. Looks like 47% of you guys answered 0 to 24%. 25% of you answered the 25 to 49%. The next largest was the 50 to 79%. And then only 8% of you believed it was in the 80 to 100% range. Believe it or not, the correct answer is the last, 80 to 100%. What we find is that actually from our recent study, 80% of 25 to 34-year-olds believe that service awards are effective and make people feel valued. It says a lot about what our millennials are thinking, which may not be as intuitive to some. Let's move on to the next slide. Let me close this out, and we'll go to the next slide, Jack. That's going to talk a little bit about some interesting data that we have to support recognition. The first is from a Glassdoor study that reveals that 4 out of every 5 employees are motivated to work harder when efforts are appreciated. Also, in a recent Engage2Excel Trend Indicators report, which focuses on length of service, space recognition, and that will be shared with all of you for participating in today's call, reveals that 81% of employees feel more appreciated when a program is in place. Also, organizations that have a formal length of service program enjoy engagement scores that are 25 points higher on average. So these are some really good, positive statistics about the importance of recognition that I think, Jack, in addition to the respect findings, really portray the importance of recognition today. And I think that statistic around 25 to 34-year-olds is really, really interesting. Obviously, the results are quite different from what most of you thought coming into the call. With that, Jack, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So what we're really showing here is that, first of all, recognition can take a variety of different forms, and that even though we may not think so going in, 25 to 34-year-olds are pumped up about service awards and what that can do to reinforce their sense of connection to the organization. Well, we hasten on because we've only dealt with the first of 7 things that employees most want. So let's take a look at exciting work. Normally, we might call this inherent job satisfaction if we were taking an academic point of view, or intrinsic job satisfaction. But this is about doing work that employees like to do. It's the notion of being excited, jazzed up about the actual content of the work. This is how employees express this in their own terms. I'd like to broaden the scope of work that I do. I want to have opportunities to excel and be challenged by the work I do, to know that the work I do makes a difference. So this is about matching the skills and abilities of the employee with the work that they're asked to perform, this whole notion of their work providing them with a sense of personal accomplishment. Sometimes the question becomes, how do we do that? How can we actually provide work that's going to be seen as more fulfilling for employees? We looked at actually 3 different conditions. You might call them a learning condition, a pioneering condition, a condition of greater autonomy or freedom to choose how to approach the work, and we compared the extent to which people in that condition versus not indicated that their job provides them with a degree of fulfillment. So, for example, cross-training would be an opportunity for people to learn more about the work and be able to take on skills that allow them to step in and replace, for example, a coworker who's leaving to go on vacation. Under conditions where cross-training is available, 73% of people indicated that the job provided a sense of fulfillment. When they're working in R&D, so at the cutting edge of innovation, 73% again indicated that the job provides a sense of fulfillment. That compares to 61% who don't have those opportunities. And when we look at the notion of remote work, which of course suggests that supervisors, leaders, the organization at large has confidence in employees to work without close supervision, 75% indicated that the job provides fulfillment versus only 61% when those conditions don't prevail. So, exciting work, there are ways to create that. A variety of different solutions can be implemented, but people want to do meaningfully challenging work. They also want to work for an organization in whom they can have confidence. It's an organization that would be well managed, that would lead to a sense of job security. Many years ago, it became just a little bit unpopular to include any questions in an employee survey about job security because organizations didn't want to provide that. Sense that perhaps there was a promise of job security. With the breaking of the psychological contract, the social contract between employees and organizations, that became a relatively less popular topic to measure in a broad-scale employee satisfaction survey. But guess what? It's still the most important thing for 1 out of every 5 employees worldwide in terms of what they're seeking. Here's how they describe it in their own terms. Not surprisingly, they want steady work, a permanent job, stability. What is this all about? Well, frankly, this is about being able to provide for the basic necessities of their lives, being able to put a roof over their heads, food on the table for their families, and accomplish what it is they're looking to accomplish in their lives. Also, the notion of being able to provide for some of the necessities that, and even more than necessities, the things that make life more enjoyable. So there's that comfort that people have from having a secure job. We actually wanted to know what impacted employees' sense of job security. And so with other items in the survey, we wanted to identify what correlated the highest with ratings of job security. These were the top 10 correlates, if you will. We could even call them drivers because this emerged from a regression analysis of what employees saw as being related to job security within their organization. Perhaps more interestingly, we could, with a little bit of engineering, collapse these 10 things into a major theory of leadership trust. Job security is often seen as a result of decisions made at the top of the organization. And what we find is that there's a leadership theory that basically says trust in leadership is a result of seeing leaders as competent, benevolent, and operating in an ethical way? Well, these drivers, if you will, of job security fit rather nicely into these three major attributes of leadership trust. By the way, CSR at the bottom of our list of drivers is simply shorthand for the whole notion of corporate social responsibility. Now the question becomes, how are leaders doing in impacting the things that cause employees to have that sense of confidence and trust? Based on our global survey using rating scale items, what we can see is that worldwide only about half of employees would describe their leaders as competent, even less as benevolent, and about half again in an ethical way. And so what this tells us is that there's a lot of runway between where employees are right now and where they could be, a lot of runway in terms of where leaders are right now as perceived by employees and what employees have in mind for their leadership in terms of how they would show up and behave and help employees create that sense and confidence of job security. All right, moving along. Pay was the next item that was mentioned. As I said before, this wasn't actually necessarily about more pay. It was about fair pay. People want to be paid fairly for the contribution that they're making to the organization. This is how employees expressed it in their own words. So this is kind of a curious thing. If it's not just about more pay, but it's really about fair pay, how do we go about ensuring that employees are paid fairly? Interestingly enough, I had the great experience of being in a situation where I knew what employees were making in terms of their actual income levels. But I wanted to understand, along with actual income level, what drove that perception of fair pay, and do pay practices really matter? And so we took a look at the relative impact of four things on the employee perception of pay fairness. And what we found was that the actual question of pay fairness.
Jack, we're going to pause here for a polling question.
All right, let's get their input on this before we advance the actual results.
Perfect. So we've got what most impacts an employee's rating of fair pay. The first is current actual pay, belief that pay is related to performance, knowing how to maximize compensation, and then understanding how pay is determined. Looks like we have about 29% of folks who have voted. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and then Jack, I'll have you reveal the actuals.
Excellent.
We're at about 65% who have voted. And we'll just give another few seconds, and then I'm going to close the poll. All right. So, Jack, I think you're going to be really interested in what folks had to say here, because it's going to align very closely to your research. So, in terms of current actual pay, folks in the line said 11% of folks in the line said current actual pay. 48% said the belief that pay is related to performance. 6% said knowing how to maximize compensation. And 36% said understanding how pay is determined. Jack, let's look at how folks stacked up against the actuals.
All right. Thank you for that, Jeff. So, a well-informed group, we might say, because when we took a look at the relative impact of those four features of what most impacted an employee's rating of fair pay, actual pay level only accounted for 10%. But another 36% was accounted for by whether or not people believe that pay is related to performance. Do they work in a pay-for-performance environment? 28% of the rating of fair pay was attributable to knowing how to maximize my compensation. And finally, 26% was attributable to understanding how my pay is determined. And so what that really tells us is that pay practices matter big time. 90% of the rating of fair pay has to do with pay practices as opposed to the actual pay level. All right, a well-informed group, you were at 90%. You divided it up a little bit differently, but in a big picture sense, you got to the same conclusion. All right, let's talk about education and career growth. One of the smaller categories, but again, this was the opportunity to develop skills over the course of a productive career. This is how employees described it in their own terms. Now, interestingly enough, we know that there's a lot of interest about how millennials view the world differently. But actually, when we ask them about opportunities for career growth and development, it turns out that millennials were the most favorable in responding to these rating scale questions about growth and development, training for their current job, manager being invested, current employer providing opportunity for skills, and believing that they can achieve their career goals at their current employer. Sometimes I think the popular press takes a concept like generational differences and blows it out of perspective. This is really bringing us back to reality, that optimistic, favorable group of employees, millennials thinking very favorably about development opportunities at their organization. Moving right along, conditions, working conditions. As I said, this is about both safety and security, but also about the circumstances being socially inviting and, in fact, having the kind of equipment and resources they need to get the job done. We have the ability, through our database, to look at the extent to which people would rate their social conditions and their physical conditions favorably. Across a variety of the major economies in the world, what we find is that actually the difference isn't significant, but for most countries, employees would say that they would rate their physical conditions slightly more favorably than their social working conditions. All right, that brings us to our next topic and our final value, if you will, of the 7 values of respect: frank, honest, and transparent communication from top leaders. We've already defined this, but in their own terms, this is how employees would characterize this, that they want to be in a work setting where they're receiving honest feedback, they know the direction the company is headed, and they also feel that their input in the spirit of two-way communication is valued. We're going to have our third and final poll question on a very interesting topic right now.
Great, thanks, Jack. I'm just going to launch this, and then we can start the voting. So the question is, what % of middle managers agree that when senior managers say something, they can believe it's true? 0 to 20%, 21 to 40, 41 to 60, 61 to 80, or 81 to 100%. So please start your voting. And it looks like we already have about half. This is a sharp group, Jack.
It really is.
All right, we're at about 69%. All right, looks like we've achieved about 74%. I'm going to close it, and then we're going to show the results here. All right, Jack, so it looks like that 41 to 60% had the most respondents at 39%. Looks like there was a tie between 21 to 40 and 61 to 80. We had 23% respectively for each of those groups. And it looks like 0 to 20% and 81 to 100% had the fewest number of respondents. How does that stack up?
Interestingly enough. All right, we'll go back to our presentation. By the way, that's almost a perfect normal distribution, by the way, for those of us with a statistical background. We don't get to see that very often. But here are the results. 54%. The question presented, as Jeff indicated, is when senior management says something, you can believe it's true globally. 54% of middle-level managers would agree or strongly agree with that question. In fact, they're the only group other than executives and senior managers who even break that 50% threshold, if you will. And even then, only 3 out of every 4 executive and senior manager would say that yes, when senior management says something, we can believe it's true. As we move to other major job categories, the results are notably lower. In fact, perhaps among the largest groups of employees, such as production and service employees or technical and professional employees, we're in that 40% range, plus or minus. So in terms of senior leadership credibility, a long way to go in providing employees with what they most want. All right, so we've had some time to look at what it is employees most want, but the question then becomes, why should we care about what employees most want? It's nice that we can summarize that in 7 easy-to-remember values that form the acronym RESPECT, but why should we care? So this is a so what and who cares type of question. Well, I'm going to answer that from the standpoint of the balanced scorecard. And what I mean by that, yes?
Before we dive into this, I just wanted to alert you, we do have a couple of questions coming in for you.
Okay.
I thought we might be able to answer those quickly before we move on. So, Melissa and Tyler, do you want to jump in with some of the questions that we've been receiving?
Sure. Actually, the first question came from Michael, and he's asking why we're using just regression as opposed to analytical techniques like structured equation modeling and discriminant function analysis.
Very good. It's a good question depending upon what you're trying to answer. But it was a more than regression when we took a look at what were the factors that most impacted employees' rating of fair pay. It was actually relative weights analysis. When we took a look at the impact on the perception of job security, we were using regression analysis. We could perhaps as easily use structural equation modeling, but it was simply a choice to use that analytic technique. What I want to share with you moving forward has more to do with, I think, some analysis you'll be quite interested in and some research circumstances that I think you'll find quite compelling as well. Do we have another question that we maybe can ask now?
Yes, please, and that actually is from Michael again, and it is, how specifically do you evaluate the impact of perceived employee experience on their behavior?
I think actually our next section is going to address that well. I think that, let us continue on with that. I do see a question here that's popped up about any data related to the impact of work stoppage or strike, that kind of thing. That certainly is a great question. What we find is that when there's been some type of trauma in the organization, it could be a work stoppage, it could be a layoff, it could be a hiring freeze. What the impact is, frankly, is about a 10 to 15 percentage point drop in a traditional employee engagement index measure. So that's a great question, and that is the experience. When that happens, and for the next 6 to 12 months, you could anticipate that.
Jeff, do we have time for a couple more questions that have come through?
Question that I see here.
I think we have time for another question, and then we'll keep going. We'll see how we're doing at the end of the session. Hopefully we can tackle a few more as well.
Great. I will do one more, which says, what is done about identifying and acting on employee complaints?
All right. I think that gets actually to the whole issue of communication upward. It's hard for employees to feel that management is telling them the truth, and therefore sense of trust with management, if there isn't the opportunity for two-way communication. So management would be, good leadership would be expected to take into consideration the employee point of view in making important decisions. They can't get that employee point of view if there isn't effective two-way communication. So that is central to leadership being viewed as operating in a way that's considerate and understanding of employee perspectives. Good questions. All right. Because of the time that we have left, I want to hasten on to a very important set of research. This gets to the question of, should we care about what employees really want? And I want to answer that question in the context of the balanced scorecard, which is typically viewed as a methodology translating a leadership team's vision, strategy, if you will, for how we're going to achieve success in the market to actual actions that are taken. And so for respect, we're going to take a look at what is the relationship between respect and employee engagement, which is a people outcome. What is the relationship between respect and operational outcomes, customer satisfaction, and financial performance, which are common ways of measuring the four elements within a traditional balanced scorecard. Let's take a look at the first as we move on here. Respect and employee engagement. All right. What happens when employees' most important want is fulfilled as it relates to a traditional or typical measure of employee engagement? As you can see, we're hovering generally on traditional measures of employee engagement close to the 80% range when employees' most important want is fulfilled. When it's not fulfilled, that drops by half at least, probably closer to 35 to 40% of the same level of feeling engaged as an employee. As Jeff indicated in his opening comments, we know that employee engagement is associated with a broad array of positive outcomes. So this is one way of asking and answering the question, why do we care about what employees think? That when employees' most important want is fulfilled, they're much more likely to be engaged. Let's take a look, though, at performance confidence. Over the course of the last 25 years, we've understood that how employees describe the work output of their organization is highly correlated to actual productivity and performance measures. Here we're taking a look at what happens for employees whose most important want is fulfilled. How do they evaluate whether or not their organization is producing high-quality products that are innovative, allowing the organization to be highly competitive, and whether or not they believe the organization has an outstanding future? Again, relatively high scores, probably hovering in that mid-70% range. But what's the contrast to that when employees' most important want is unfulfilled? It drops significantly. So those organizations who are doing a good job of providing employees with what they most want are also those organizations whose employees have a great deal of confidence in the future performance of the organization. One might argue that we're just correlating, in effect, employee opinions with employee opinions. So let's ratchet that up to a different kind of linkage research. This is actually data that emerged in 2012 from 236 organizations worldwide, headquartered in 18 countries, representing all major industry groups, and between 20 and 25% of the Fortune 500 list of major organizations. In fact, these were large organizations who, on average, employed more than 100,000 employees. So let's take a look at the relationship between respect and that third outcome measure, customer satisfaction. And what we find that employees who are in the top 25% on a measure of respect actually are in organizations achieving American Customer Satisfaction Index scores of 80 or above. Those in the bottom 25% are achieving an ACSI index score of 74.3. Now, without some interpretation, this is not particularly meaningful, but the reality is that a score of 80 or above on the ACSI is a terrifically impressive score. This is an index produced by the University of Michigan. It measures how customers are relating to the product and service provided by that organization. into the United States. So it could be a U.S.-based organization, or it could be an organization based outside. A score of 75 or below is actually considered a very weak score. And CEOs of those organizations are really in the hot seat in terms of needing to change up the mix of how they deliver their product and service. So yet another reason we should care about what employees most want. Those organizations who do a good job of providing that are also having a lot more success with their customers. And then as we get to the fourth quadrant of the balanced scorecard, we see that actually organizations in the top 25%, not quite, but almost doubling the operating margin. This is basically a measure of profitability before the application of certain G&A expenses. And even when we take it a step further and look at stock market, take into consideration stock market considerations, shareholder return, those organizations in the top 25% are outdistancing those organizations in the bottom 25% on 3-year total shareholder return by 23 percentage points. And so as we work our way around the balanced scorecard, we really are seeing that organizations who do a good job of providing what employees most want have more engaged employees who are more confident, they have higher levels of customer satisfaction, and in fact they are delivering a significantly greater performance at the organizational level. Well, sometimes I'm asked, how does respect align with employee engagement? And there are a lot of definitions of employee engagement. Jeff provided one at the beginning. It's pretty mainstream. But there are also a lot of points of view about what actually drives employee engagement. Most organizations that are conducting employee surveys today are really doing it for the purpose of being an employer of choice. They're interested in engagement. They're interested in retaining their staff. What drives that? And what's the flow of employee engagement? This is actually what's derived from the academic literature on the flow of employee engagement. It actually starts with organizational policies and practices that are put in place by leaders of the organization. That's what is upstream from employee engagement, which is a psychological state that creates the conditions under which people are more willing to apply discretionary effort, which of course is perceived as preceding higher individual, team, and organizational performance. All right, so that's what the literature tells us about how this works, how this operates in a sense of flow. But then the question becomes, what really drives employee engagement? And to what extent is it related to respect? Well, we understand that employee engagement is really driven by 4 things. That's what the literature tells us. Leaders who build trust and confidence, managers who recognize and respect subordinates, growth and development opportunities, and whether or not people are really jazzed up by the work itself. So how does that correspond to what we've just learned about what employees most want? Well, interestingly enough, when we think about leaders build trust and confidence among their employees, we actually see, of course, that touching on the truth condition. We see that touching on the security condition, because after all, we have to trust our leaders to have a sense of job security. And it also touches on the extent to which leaders have emphasized safety and security, but also positive interpersonal team chemistry. Well, with regard to managers who recognize and respect employees, clearly there's a connection to the recognition of respect, a connection to fair pay, the P of respect, and again, a connection to positive working conditions, especially in the promotion of positive interpersonal team chemistry and making sure that people are supported through, for example, policies like work and family life balance. Growth and development, that's a direct education and career growth. And then finally, the work itself, another perfect hit, because that's just another way of saying exciting work. And so when we think about what are the mechanisms that create an engaged workforce, actually delivering respect is one of those mechanisms for how that's accomplished. Now, putting this in just exactly on time, even with those additional polling questions. So we have a few minutes left where perhaps we can take a look at some of those additional questions that have come up from the audience. I'll refer to my colleagues to see if we have some additional questions, or perhaps we could summarize several questions that seem to touch on the same basic issue and try to answer them more broadly.
Jack, I'll start with some additional questions we have. One is, how are employee advocacy and commitment being defined?
All right, so advocacy and commitment. So advocacy would be defined fairly directly as, am I willing, do I feel sufficiently good about the place I work that I would be willing to recommend it as a good place to work to my family members and to my close friends? And so that's advocacy. Commitment is more about, am I committed to staying with the organization? So you would ask that through questions like, I rarely consider leaving this organization for a job at another company. Or you could ask it in a reverse way, I'm seriously considering leaving this organization in the next 12 months for reasons other than retirement. So that's what we mean. That's how we would operationally define advocacy and commitment. Good question. What else might?
Sure. Beyond the macro, ACSI scores correlate poorly to actual behavior. Same with NPS and CES. Do you have a more actionable dependent measure?
Actually, it's hard to imagine at an organizational level organization effective measures that would be more dependable or reliable than the ACSI. That's produced by the University of Michigan. It's a highly regarded measure of organizational success. It's used as a predictor of organizational performance and is routinely regarded by economists and social scientists as a very effective measure. With regard to organizational performance more broadly, if you were to talk to those who spend their lifetimes measuring organizational performance, you would find that the way they approach that is typically one of four measures. There could be accounting measures, as such as return on sales, and fundamentally that's what the operating profit measure was that I used. That would be an accounting measure, as would return on assets. You could also use measures that take into consideration the market. We used one of those, total shareholder return, or you could use earnings per share. You could use very advanced hybrid measures of success like Altman's Z or Tobin's Q, and then you can incorporate subjective measures. This would be things like ranking on the Fortune 500 most admired companies list, or even customer satisfaction ratings. So actually, if we were to do a primer on how to measure organizational effectiveness, we would be focused on one or more of those four major types of measures, all of which were included in this linkage research.
Great. Jack, we have time for one more question, and of the questions that we have not been able to answer, we will follow up with you in an email and answer all the questions that you have asked. We actually have one under the financial outcomes slide. They're asking what TSR stands for. It's on the BSC.
Right. We did move through that fairly quickly, but TSR is total shareholder return. And in this case, we were looking at that at a 3-year level. And the reason we chose 3 years is because we wanted to look at something that gave us a broader view of performance that incorporated both the performance of the company and the value of the stock, as opposed to simply focusing only on annual measures, a one-shot measure in time, so to speak. And so that was done very consciously to give us a broader perspective over a longer period of time in terms of organizational performance. Well, I think with that, and given how close we are to the end of the hour, I simply wanted to share with people that you can learn more about this through Respect. A book has been published by that same title. And if you're interested in additional information that is more detailed and presented in a slightly more scientific way, perhaps, I could offer 2 articles that you may want to access that take a look at these relationships between what employees most want and organizational success, and also how would we design an employee survey that actually is a predictor of organizational success. And so these 2 articles published in the not too distant past would be ways to start that exploration or add to your knowledge base there. And so with that, I believe I will turn it back over to Kathy.
Great. Thank you very much, Jack, and also Jeff, for presenting this very informative webcast today. The archive webcasts and slides will be available on the HR.com site within 24 hours. You will receive an email from HR.com with the certification credit information within 1 to 2 business days. Engage2Excel and HR.com do appreciate your feedback, so please take a moment at the very end of the webcast to complete the evaluation survey, which will appear on your screen. This concludes our webcast, and thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.